Hey folks, I'm not quite dead. Yet. Which is a good thing for the deck-building roguelike fans in the audience, since I've got the chance to challenge Ground Shatter Studios' Knights in Tight Spaces, their sequel to Fights in Tight Spaces, which sees you going medieval both figuratively and literally. And it's not just a coat of paint, since there's been a few new features forged for this release. But was it enough to shatter all my expectations, or were the issues in Night more than a flesh wound? I'm your host Arlian, let's find out together. Starting with the first of the notable changes, the narrative. See, while Fights in Tight Spaces could essentially be summed up as a series of singular, quip-laden scenes to set up a stage, or a bit of banter to color an encounter during the DLC, Knights in Tight Spaces offers a sprawling adventure with a fair amount of details to soak in. Specifically, this time around you take the role of the Hustler, which is a fancy way of saying a troublemaker for hire with a hell of a bar tab. So really, not the sort of person that normally find themselves basically press-ganged into service by a clandestine organization in service of foiling continent-spanning conspiracies. Though most plots to throw a kingdom into chaos don't entail the weaponization of a fledgling magic user population or the possibility of otherworldly incursion. Frankly, it's enough to make the dash of undeath seem normal. So yeah, it's a pretty neat premise to explore, which it does through dialogue scenes at set moments throughout the quest, serving to gradually reveal the catastrophe as it continues to spiral, and showcase the manner in which the Hustler bumbles, brawls, and banters their way through from start to finish. And honestly, the writing itself is pretty fun, especially once you realize that it does take into account a number of your decisions throughout the journey. Choose to go through the entire journey solo? It's commented on. Pick up some companions along the way? Well, now they'll throw in their 2 cents. And hey, you can even repeatedly reject the opportunity to join ye olde secret agency. It's valid. And that's not even the entirety of the story either, because you can unlock even more narrative tidbits by playing through the game as an attuned magic user, giving you more insight into the events than a fisticuff-focused fool would normally find out about, which also sets the stage for an entirely different outcome to the game, if you're inclined to follow an altogether alternate final act which provides some very nifty, very unique challenges. Quite frankly, I found the story to be a treat, and that actually extends to the side quests too, since they all tend to be fairly enjoyable. But yeah, that's the narrative in a nutshell, so let's get to the parts y'all are probably eager to hear about. The gameplay. And as far as that goes, veterans of its predecessor, Fights in Tight Spaces, will be off to a fairly strong start given its fundamentals carry forward. Which is to say, as much as players need to focus on building a cohesive deck around the basic elements of attack and defense, they also have an extra dimension to keep track of. Specifically, the existence of a tactical grid battlefield that needs to be navigated in tandem with the game's 3-phase combat system. Let me break it down a bit. So, the first phase for every round is the enemy's preparation phase, where they do their best to move into the optimal position to murder you and line up their attacks. The game even helpfully labels the order in which they're going to unleash their attacks on you. Really, it's a little daunting sometimes when you're in the eponymous tight space and you're outnumbered 4 or 5 to 1, but it's fine because that's when the second phase kicks in and you're given the opportunity to even the odds. If you're prepared. See, while enemy movements and attacks are consistent relative to their type, the player functions a bit differently since their mobility is instead tied to cards. That's right, not only are you juggling the creation of a deck with offensive and defensive options, you also have to mind positioning in the myriad ways it can take shape. For instance, while pretty much any card will allow you to move vertically or horizontally, that doesn't help if you happen to find yourself cornered. Unless, of course, you have cards in your deck that let you slide through an enemy or slip through their side and flank them. Heck, some of them even let you vault over objects. The trick, of course, is making sure you don't overstack them in your deck and ensure that you'll have the action points needed to spend them since they use the same resources as any other card. Not that that's necessarily a problem per se, since a well-placed dodge can just as easily lead to an enemy dying, since ranged attacks will still fire at a location you formerly occupied if an enemy was there. And even that isn't your only option, given there's cards which also allow you to swap spots with an enemy, shove or redirect them to another location, or even more offensive cards which double as movement and enemy positional options, albeit with the stipulation that you need to have an overt target. Seriously, the basics that have been carried forward from fights in tight spaces are juicy. But it doesn't just stop at those basics. Oh no, there are changes, with a seemingly simple one being an overall larger number of starting kits, called archetypes. Much like the OG, these shape the initial deck you're handed, unless you choose to draft a deck from random pulls. That said, these do function a bit differently than their predecessors. For one thing, they no longer start with a passive ability anymore. Rather, they interact with a new system introduced, the gear system. Yeah, instead of playing around with a pool of passive abilities to acquire, you're instead given a modifier to certain damage types and weapon proficiencies, like an attune's ability to cast magic. Or, well, like the ability of every class except the Brawler to equip weapons. Which is important, since a number of cards need certain types of weapons to trigger. Which, yes, the Brawler archetype is locked out of all of those cards given they lack a weapon slot, or armor slots for that matter. Still, they aren't completely at a loss given there's a third slot dedicated to consumable items, which obviously are consumed when used, but provide potent effects and are always available. Admittedly, I was more keen on the fact that there's also auxiliary items that you can stick in that slot, such as a cloak that grants a free movement card every turn, which is an absolutely beastly defensive option. As it stands, I think this is a pretty neat change from the perk system that existed in the first game. Sure, you could stack more of them up over the course of the game, and by extension, create some pretty nasty combinations, but it felt a bit more arbitrary, whereas the equipment slots can be freely changed around between fights, allowing you to adapt towards certain bosses and encounters. Whether that comes in the form of becoming an absolutely tanky little turtle, building loadouts based around gang-beating enemies, or simply stacking as much raw damage boost as humanly possible. Whatever the case, the world is your soon-to-be savaged oyster. And it's great. And made even better once you realize you don't have to go it alone. Like, don't get me wrong, like I said in the story segment, it's entirely viable to do so. But Kits really does give some pretty good incentives to dabble with its party system. For one thing, you have another character on the field, which means enemies will divide their attention and attempt to murder someone other than the hustler. I mean, sure, this does technically add a bit of a wrinkle insofar as the fact that you need to juggle the movement and positioning of 2 or 3 characters, but that's where the second perk kicks in. Each new character provides you an additional card draw at the start of your turn, meaning more odds of getting movement cards or an offensive card you can put to good use, and more momentum, which serves as the action points you spend to execute moves. And more attacks also means you'll generate combo faster, a second resource that builds up whenever you execute an attack, and which can be used to play combo cards which don't use momentum. Like, sure, there is some management involved there since most movement cards drain combo relevant to the spaces you move, and some cards spend all your combo for extra effects, but on the whole, it allows you to capitalize on that system even more if you play your cards right. But wait! There's more. If you happen to have an enemy flanked by your other characters, they'll take a swing on that enemy as well, allowing you to amp up your overall damage output substantially with a bit of finagling. Just, don't get sloppy, because regardless of whether your other characters are hale and hearty, the moment you let the hustler die, the game ends. But again, that is why it's really nice to have multiple targets. That said, as nifty as these elements are, there is one particular combat element that comes to mind that wasn't quite as enticing for me, and that's namely the fact that a few of the stages are rather large and expansive, which can make the act of getting close and personal with an enemy a bit of a nuisance if they prefer ranged combat and you don't have great movement options. Still, that's a fairly minor nitpick on the whole, especially since the stages at large did a decent job of keeping me engaged, especially since each one still has optional objectives like clearing it within a certain number of turns, avoiding taking damage, or doing things like throwing enemies off the board. In any case, that's the fighting side of things, but that's not all there is to kits, because they've actually tweaked how progressing through stages go. Like, most of the basics are still the same insofar as you choosing a route between several paths based on the sort of rewards they give you, like equipment, gold, or extra max health and combo points. And like before, there are locations that let you upgrade cards and heal. But there's also one that lets you buy and upgrade equipment, which again, gives way more flexibility than perks in base fights in tight spaces. What's more, you have options for which characters you'd like to recruit at the tavern location. And there's also a necromancer. If you've been really sloppy and need to bring someone back, it's fine. That said, the biggest change on this front is how they address events. See, in fights in tight spaces, events were a pretty big gamble, since you were often likely to run into encounters which could be largely bad with some fairly lackluster rewards. To the point that I found myself skipping them as much as possible, since at least the fights were not only predictable, they were frequently better than the bulk of what you'd find and didn't entail any gambling. So you can imagine how pleasantly surprised I was when I discovered that the events had been changed into side quests. See, midway through a given chapter, you'll be given the option of an immediate benefit like healing, or to unlock a number of side missions scattered about the map. What's nice about this is that you can wholly ignore them, or poke at them any given time during the chapter, allowing you to bulk up your gear and party before tackling one. What's more, it averts the random misfortune that fits seem to thrive off of. Like yes, a given choice you make in a mission can impact it, but you're always walking away with some kind of reward. It's an absolute delight to engage with and very convenient. Oh, also, speaking of convenience, there is a chapter select once you've reached a given portion of the game. While this can be a bit punishing, since it means you're wandering in with a fresh loadout and no gear, if you're keen to pick up where you left off and you're feeling your oats, it's a viable option, especially since the chapters can be pretty lengthy. And that's without even taking into account that there's an optional route you can opt into, which substantially ramps up the difficulty by introducing an absolute slew of unique bosses with their own mechanics. Like even on the base route, a number of boss encounters can absolutely body you if you're not prepared, but the true route is pretty brutal if you don't have a deck capable of mitigating a given mechanic. Or pure cheese, such as an absolutely disgusting combination of damage scaling and jab cards, especially when you can invite some friends to join in. It's definitely a bit of a display, and I mean that on more than one level, given that, like its predecessor, Knights in Tight Spaces does have a rather stylish bent to it. The overall animations for each card make them fairly fun to execute, especially with some of the more elaborate ones you can play, as well as the different animations for the various weapon types. That said, I wasn't quite as enamored with the replay feature this time around. It didn't feel quite as fluid, possibly because it's executed a bit slower than before, with a bit more of a noticeable gap between the various attacks. Still, that's a pretty minor flaw on the whole, especially since the overall design is still quite solid. Oh, and before I forget, I really do need to give the audio credit. There's definitely some good tunes to crack some skulls to, even some 30-odd hours later. But yeah, that's the long of things, so I'll sum things up quickly as I can for the conclusion, and the simple fact of the matter is Knights in Tight Spaces provides a lot of innovations and improvements over its predecessor. There's so many new systems to learn, and which play with all the mechanics introduced in fits, which made for a fresh experience. The weapon and class systems were interesting to fiddle around with, as was the way they changed the overall effectiveness of cards. And I really can't emphasize just how much switches up if you choose to engage with the party system, since the way it works is a load of fun to fiddle around with. Though, again, not wholly necessary since it's optional, and there's still quite a bit of satisfaction to be found in making your way forward on your own some. Oh, and you cannot imagine how thrilled I was with the changes to the events. Like, I can't say this enough. That It vexed me so much in fights in tight spaces how they worked, so this change left me happy as a clam. Actually, are clams happy? That's actually a bit of an... 1 second. Anyways, while I did comment that the game did feel a bit lengthy at times, especially given the extra effort placed into its overarching narrative, even that's been addressed in a fairly timely fashion with the release of the new Tight mode, which shortens the overall exodus by a fair degree. Which is to say, not only does it shorten the narrative elements of the adventures in a funny way, it also provides a new means of advancing by plunking down stronghold tiles, which can be accessed at any time. Which is important once you realize that these are the boss fights and quite literally enable the ability to bring a chapter to a close once you feel prepared enough for the next one, without going through every other encounter in your way. It's quite good and lets you focus on the meatiness of just brawling with throngs of enemies. And that's not even your only option on that front either, because if you're the sort looking for a challenge in a sea of baddies to bruise, there's also an endless mode to engage with. So yeah, if you're a fan of the tactical elements of navigating a grid while engaging in tightly coordinated flights of fisticuffs, I cannot recommend Knights in Tight Spaces enough. It warrants a crit hit rating much like its predecessor, though, small aside here, for some unfathomable reason, they still haven't added a feature that lets you preview what the upgraded variant of a card would look like on the deck selection screen in case you're specifically trying to find out if it would be a good addition, or to check the maps and scout out whether there's a spot where you can remove unwanted cards while you are on that end screen or the like. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you have something to say, leave a comment. If you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews and interviews, hit subscribe and the bell. For a link to my Discord, the Crit Hit Cauldron, check the description, and my Patreon to see reviews early and support the channel, like Andy Noted's done. Also, I have a merch house with neat swag like Crit Hit coffee mugs and shirts. That said, I'll catch you on the next episode of Crit Hit. Hopefully it'll come out a lot sooner than this one. I have been dealing with nearly losing my home. Spoilers, it has been a lot. But yeah, no, hopefully next one will come a lot sooner. Take care till then, folks. And also, I'm working currently on a little fun gamey channel to tackle games that might not necessarily get reviews, but I do want to have people see and discover. There will eventually be links to that channel when there's actually content on it. Bye!